Building on the leadership themes of our first panel, our second expert panel will translate research into inclusive and equitable actions with impact that societies can take. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Vicki Magley. Dr. Vicki Magley will be the moderator of this panel. She is the professor of psychological sciences at the University of Connecticut. She was a member of the NASM committee that generated the 2018 report on the harassment of women in academic science, engineering, and medicine. She is also a dedicated friend and advisor to the consortium since its inception. We are always so grateful for Dr. Magley's wisdom and generous contributions. We will also have 3 panelists for this session. First is Dr. Larry Martinez. Dr. Martinez is an associate professor and the associate chair in the Department of Psychology at Portland State University, whose research includes a focus on creating climates that enable students to participate as their authentic selves. He is a leader of mentoring programming for students of color and the LGBT committee at the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. Our second panelist is Cheryl Enderlein. She is the Vice President of Leadership and Volunteer Services at the American Geophysical Union and has been a leader in advancing inclusive governance strategies at AGU. And finally, our third panelist will be Dr. NiCole Buchanan of Michigan State University, who is a professor of psychology. Her research focuses on the intersection of gender and race in harassment and epistemic exclusion of valuable and innovative research by women and people of color. This is Dr. Buchanan's second appearance at a consortium convening, as she will be elevating a new tool that she and partners are developing to measure epistemic exclusion to help prioritize its elimination. We are so grateful to our moderator and panelists for their important work and willingness to share their knowledge with the consortium. And with that, I am going to now turn the panel over to Dr. Magley and Larry Martinez. Dr. Martinez.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for having me. I think that my portion of this talk is to talk about a mentoring program and a pipeline program, an initiative that the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology initiated this last year. We're just finishing the first year of doing this, so it's still very new. We're still calling the first year a pilot program because it was something that we are still kind of figuring out a little bit, but I think it was a big success the first year. So I'm here to share some of the things that we did in order to create a systematic and systemic initiative at the society level for increasing racial diversity. See, we can go to the next slide. So just the background context of why this was necessary for us. For graduates with PhDs in IO psychology in 2019, only 20% or only 10% were identified as being Black, 10% identified as being Hispanic, and less than 1% identified as being American Indian. And if we think about this in the broader context of social science, if we go to the next slide, we see similar trends with getting paid research or teaching or research assistantships while earning PhDs. So when people are in PhD programs for psychology and social sciences more broadly, so this isn't industrial organizational psychology in particular, but just sort of more broadly, we're seeing only 21% are identifying as Black, 34% identifying as Hispanic, but 47% are identifying as white. And these paid positions are really important because that's a level of access to funding and a level of access to opportunities that really help people finish their PhDs by having, funded opportunities and not having to pay their own way. And this is particularly relevant for people who are racial minorities because of the systemic sort of issues that they have to deal with, even to get to a place where they're competitive for PhD programs. So, and that's sort of the background, and what we wanted to do, if we want to go to the next slide, is really focus on a pipeline initiative to prepare underrepresented students, and the focus for this was on race. We have the best data at SciOp about race. We don't have great data about sexual orientation or about gender identity or disability status or other identities, but we do have sort of good data about race, and the data that we do have suggests that the situation is not very good. And in our field, which I think is pretty typical also of other fields as well, is that there's a particular gap between PhD programs and representation and master's programs and representation. And of course, the big difference there is that not only is there a difference in the level of academic attainment, but also in the level of support that's being given to the students, right? PhD programs in our field are typically funded, whereas PhD program or master's programs in our field typically are not funded. So you see actually greater representation in master's programs with regard to race and ethnicity than you do in PhD programs, which seems good on the surface, but I think a careful look at this would potentially suggest that we're shunting racial minorities into opportunities that are less prestigious and that they have to pay for, right? So the purpose of this was to focus on funded PhD programs in industrial organizational psychology. So what we did was put together a 3-part pipeline initiative. And the first part, I'll get into the details here a little bit, was a large virtual conference. So one of the things that we identified, particularly for people who are racial minorities and particularly for people who are interested in our field, is that our field isn't very well represented in like introductory psychology textbooks. A lot of people don't understand what industrial organizational psychology is. They don't know that it is a thing that even exists. If we're lucky, people will say they want to go into HR, which is similar, but it's not exactly what we do. And therefore, one of the initiatives that we wanted to do was just raise awareness, right? And there's other committees and other groups in SciOp that are trying to do that. But one of the things that we did was just try and create a virtual conference so that we could introduce people who may not have IO psychologists at their universities or IO psychology PhD programs at their universities, but nonetheless want to get more information, and just provide information about what IO psychology is as a field, and what people need to do in order to prepare themselves to enter that field and be competitive for a PhD program that's funded. So specifically, it was a 2-day event. It was 6 hours total, so 3 hours each day. And every hour was focused on a different topic. So one topic could be just what IO psychology is, different opportunities in the field. Another topic was how to prepare for graduate school applications, just the really basic bare bones, like you need letters of recommendation and you need, GRE scores and stuff like that. We had one session that was actually a panel of current graduate students to give like a day in the life and give that perspective of what it's like to be in a PhD program as a racial minority person. And that was the first day. The second day was more long-term career planning, actually interviewing at PhD programs, and a lot of time for questions and answers about how to get people into those sort of positions. We made a concerted effort also to bring a variety of different speakers. So every session, every hour that we had at least 3 different speakers, with me as the moderator. We wanted to get representation from, I mentioned the grad students, but we had academicians from all different levels, assistant, associate, and full professors. We had, I think, an emeritus professor. We had professors who had served as the president of SciOp. I think we had 2 former presidents as presenters. And we had a variety. Our field is a little bit unique that a lot of us go into industry or into consulting types of work. And we had good representation from industry and consultants and more applied sort of avenues of people with PhDs. All of them also identified as racial minorities themselves. I thought that was important to demonstrate the representation that we had. The other thing that I think was really good about the virtual conference is that we kicked off the conference with a welcome from the current SciOp president. So this was kind of his brainchild. I'm going to talk about him a little bit more in a minute, but he introduced the panel and the whole conference, and highlighted how important it was for SciOp as an organization, as a society, to do this, and how much effort has gone into it. And then we closed the conference with the incoming next president of SciOp to give sort of that consistency, right? So we have the former president and then the new president, both of which are here advocating for the program. So having that buy-in from the top, I think, is really key. We had over 500 people register for the virtual conference, which is 5 times more than what we were planning on accommodating, but we were happy to make the adjustments that we needed to have everybody come. After that, what we did was a 10-week mentoring program. And this was designed to address the need for applicants in IO psychology to have some research experience. It's really difficult to get into a PhD program that's funded if you haven't worked in a lab, if you haven't contributed to research in some way. So we wanted to create an opportunity for people who, again, don't happen to be going to undergraduate institutions where there are IO psychologists there. So we invited the registrants from the virtual conference to apply for the 10-week mentoring program. We vetted their applications. We picked 12 scholars to participate. We paired them with 12 mentors, and each scholar joined a mentor's lab in whatever way that made sense for the mentor and the scholar. And they spent 10 weeks contributing to some kind of a research project. And it's not like they collected their own data necessarily, and it's not like they necessarily wrote their own papers, but they were fully embedded in whatever that researcher was doing at the time. And my understanding is that a lot of those mentoring relationships have continued throughout the time. The last part of the 3-part sort of initiative is the attendance at the annual conference. So we also recognized that attending the SciOp conference is a really good networking opportunity, and it demonstrates, especially as a pre-doctoral student, it demonstrates commitment to the field and a willingness to be, part of our society. So the 12 scholars were given an opportunity to fly to Seattle to attend our conference in person with the mentors. And we created a small poster session also to allow them the opportunity to present the results of what they had been working on over the course of the 10-week mentorship program. So that's sort of the nitty-gritty details about what we did. And we're starting over again this year. So we can go on to the next slide. If you're wondering about how we did this, one thing that I think is really important is we had a really energetic president. The president that I'm referring to actually started this initiative before he became president. Our presidencies are only for 1 year, so he felt that he needed to capitalize on that time and wanted everything in place when he took over as president. So what he did was created the task force that was a bunch of diversity scholars and people with diverse perspectives themselves to try and figure out what are we going to do. And then the last component, I think it's, so those 2 things were really important. And we had buy-in from the executive board as well. So we came with the plan and they funded the entire thing for 5 years from discretionary money at the society, with the expectation that then we would be able to become self-sustaining. So here's just a couple of pictures of, there's me and my mentee, and then Dr. Magley with her mentee, and then a couple other mentees presenting their research at the conference. So it's an ongoing initiative. We hope to expand it. We hope to make it even more robust in the future. But I think it's a really good example of a society taking it upon itself to put a lot of energy and resources into a dedicated pipeline program.
Thank you, Larry. I have a really, really quick question to throw at you for like a 10-second, 15-second answer if you can. So this focused purely on kind of racialized identities. It could focus on any kind of intersectional type of lens. So do you see any sort of challenges on taking any other particular intersectional lens, or do you think it could be implemented in a, like, here's the approach, you just have to kind of implement it?
Yeah, I think that that's right. I really tried to focus on intersectionality, and one of the things that we ran into is we don't have data. When we're trying to make the case with the executive board and with the society, they really wanted to know about the data and follow the data. And because we didn't have great data about intersectionality, about international types of identities, about disability, they decided that the focus, for now at least, needed to be on race and ethnicity. So I think that's a really good opportunity for expansion that I would really want to push for.
And highlights the necessity of data, right? Of those,
exactly.
Gathering that kind of information. Thank you so much. Yeah. We'll come back to you once we get to kind of Q&A stuff at the end. But if we can have Cheryl start next. Thank you.
I guess that I need to take off my mute, right? I covered up my mute button, so I'd move all my papers. Hi, my name is Cheryl, and I work for AGU, which is the American Geophysical Union. And just a quick shout out to Billy Williams, because I think he kicked you off earlier today. We worked together at AGU, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about AGU. Here's our new definition of our organization. We're an international nonprofit association supporting an inclusive community of Earth and space scientists and partners. You can go back, I'm not ready yet. Thank you. We're supporting an inclusive community of Earth and space scientists and partners who are dedicated to discovery and solutions to societal challenges. I put more information about our organization and background material for my presentation in, I think, 3 documents that have been posted in your participant materials guide for a breakout later this afternoon. And Lisa or Taylor can drop more information about that in the chat if we need to. So the next slide, please. So I'm here today to tell you a story about how AGU gave students and early career scientists leadership opportunities, and how that not only changed AGU as an organization and helped us accomplish the future that our volunteer leaders and members envisioned, but also had a huge impact on people like Christy Till, who's quoted here, because they embraced the leadership opportunities that they were given. Next slide, please. The story starts over a decade ago. I arrived at AGU in 2010, and when I arrived, AGU was very successful as an organization, and they referred to themselves as a sleeping giant. And so a group of volunteers led the charge to re-envision the future, and they asked themselves and others, what could AGU be? And today, just over a decade later, we are living in the future that they envisioned then. Their perspective on student and early career scientists played a very significant role in us being able to accomplish that. Next slide, please. What was their perspective? They told me, always have the future at the table. So in other words, in order to accomplish the future they envisioned, they made a commitment to having the future students and early career scientists in all volunteer groups that were formed. And I'm just going to say to you, as somebody who had never experienced this before coming to AGU in 2010, that one move completely changes the conversation. Next slide, please. So this is Dr. Rosie Oakes, and I just want to introduce you to her. She's an early career scientist who is currently serving on our Science Council of 75 people. She plays an equal role to everyone else on the council, including much more senior people, even those who have global gravitas. She was also elected by council members to a leadership position on the council leadership team. And on this slide, she identifies the value that she has gained from this leadership opportunity. She's in her 4th year of this opportunity. So let me just call a few things out. So she's saying it gave her a voice in her community at a time she didn't feel that she had one. And that she commented that AGU actively seeks the opinions of her demographic. And that being a part of this leadership position, especially the council leadership team, it restored her faith in the publishing system because she got to see how the editors-in-chiefs were selected. And also she said that being involved in a leadership of an organization helped her understand how things worked at her own organization. So this is what Rosie said the value of leadership position was to her individually. Now let me talk about what's the impact on the organization. Next slide, please. So the impact is profound, and the ripple effect goes way beyond what is obvious. Let's just take these bullets one at a time. So looking back over the past decade, I truly believe that AGU would have not been able to accomplish its mission and vision as quickly or as well without the voices of the student and early career leaders in every conversation. I've shared in this presentation already insights from 2 early career leaders at AGU, and there are so many more. However, the impact doesn't end with the impact on them personally. It actually impacts everyone in the room. The other volunteer leaders and the staff, we gain tremendously from the perspectives that they bring. I also have stories about how volunteering at AGU benefits their organization, their university, or their employer because of the transferable skills they gain. For instance, just a really simple example. I run my meetings completely differently, and now everybody wants to serve on whatever groups I'm leading because I give them an agenda, I give them background material, and I have an order to my meeting. That's just a really simple example. It's one I've heard quite a bit. And then with all of this together, science has obviously benefited broadly, and it makes the world a better place. Next slide, please. So when I hear people talk about student and early career leadership opportunities, I almost always hear it in the context of diversity and inclusion. And that has really struck me as I've listened to other people talk about their organizations and what they're doing to give student and early career, to develop them or give them opportunities. Will you click again, please? AGU, so in thinking about that, I just realized AGU took a really different route. Right out of the gate, 2010, have the future in the room for every conversation. We really looked at this as a strategy. We weren't even talking about diversity and inclusion in 2010. And now, even though we have having student and early career leader as a diversity criteria for forming every group, that's not actually why we're doing it. Our idea really was to have a strategy that would give real meaningful leadership opportunities to the future generation because it would impact them and it would impact us. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? Well, this is one of the things that I posted in the Google Drive for the session this afternoon. There's a lot of detail behind this, but let me just do a high-level summary. In 2010, we had recomposed our science council, and we used all 5 of the at-large appointed positions to give them to student and early career scientists. Everybody else on this council was elected at that time. So before the first election, the next election, 2012, we created 6 permanent positions on the council. And I'll say to you, as soon as we presented this and they said yes, we were like, we should have asked for twice as many because this was way too easy. So those 6 permanent positions on the council led to Christy Till, the person I started this story with, She got elected as the council vice chair, and that gave her a seat on the board. And now all of a sudden, 3 years in, we realized the value of having an early career voice on the board. So before the next election in 2014, we said we're always going to have an early career person on the board. And so we actually have a dedicated position for that. And then it just keeps going and going and going, right? It goes way beyond our council and our board into every single committee that we have. Next slide, please. So let's just go back to where I started, which is, what future are you envisioning for your organization? And as you think about that, have you given any thought to how student and early career members of your association might be your best resource for accomplishing that? Next slide. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Cheryl, so much. One of the things between your and Larry's presentations is really highlighting this importance of these early career spaces, right? Either explicitly early career or even pre-career, right? And so this session then kind of morphs into our last presenter with NiCole Buchanan, and she'll pop up here pretty soon, I think, where she's now going to be thinking about kind of making sure that we really ensure the impact of research of mature scientists. So we've got kind of this whole lifespan of kind of the people in professional societies and how we operationalize really diversity initiatives across this lifespan of professional society members. So NiCole, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk with you today. I'm really excited to be here and really excited about the opportunity of thinking about how is it that societies can become come into partnership in helping to reduce some of these challenges that scholars experience. Next slide. And very quickly, I want to make the point that one, we've experienced a lot of benefit from our funders. This work has been made possible that I'm going to share with you today because of funding that we've had across several programs, local and federal. And I think the work stands for itself and speaks for itself, but I do want to caution that I don't speak for the funders and they may not share our findings, opinions, or conclusions and recommendations. Next slide. I also want to acknowledge that I have an amazing group of collaborators, and they are the reason this work is possible. So as you can see, we are a distinctive group, an interdisciplinary group that represents diversity across race, gender, disciplines, perspectives, and scholarly approaches. And this is really important because doing scholarly innovation and excellence requires diversity, and the diversity of our team is inherent in our success. Next slide. So we're going to talk today about epistemic exclusion. Next slide. We did an expansive reach and trying to understand what epistemic could be. And we came up with the theory of epistemic exclusion ecosystem. And this diagram represents our theory. This is the broadest level of how we're thinking about epistemic exclusion, or you'll hear me say EE for short. At the top, you see white boxes, and you can see that we're theorizing that epistemic exclusion is comprised of formal processes and informal economies of scholarly exclusion. These occur within systems of evaluation, along with informal mechanisms or processes that, although not formal, still maintain scholarly exclusion. And then surrounding the experiences of epistemic exclusion are denials and resistance to those claims. This can include cultural gaslighting, where people may refuse to acknowledge that epistemic exclusion is occurring, negating and invalidating one's grievances about interpersonal or structural unfairness in the processes, and would occur if, say, you're experiencing EE, but colleagues tell you you're imagining that you're experiencing anything that was unfair. And we theorize that these types of invalidations could come after experiences of formal or informal epistemic exclusion. And importantly, they then serve to maintain the exclusion within the academic unit. And epistemic exclusion can also be maintained more distally within disciplines, within academia writ large, and through societal attitudes. And we're not going to focus on that within the survey that I'm going to share with you today, but it's important to know that our societal values and attitudes shape academic values and disciplinary norms. And then these have upstream effects on the values of academia more broadly. And to the extent that academia establishes ideas about scholarly value, inclusion, and success, these then will affect societal attitudes. And at all of these levels, we propose that epistemic exclusion is maintained distally through three types of processes. First, there are identity-based stereotypes about who can be a legitimate and competent scholar. And you could see this in disciplinary narratives that women aren't good at math, for example, or that people of color lack the genius necessary to succeed in theoretical mathematics. We can also see ideologies of quality that detail the types of scholarly work that could be perceived as rigorous, high quality, and things like that. So some of our past research suggests that high quality scholarly work in many disciplines is work that is seen as being, say, more objective, not connected to social justice or to other activist orientations, that it's often quantitative, or that it does not focus on marginalized groups of people. And there are also legitimizing ideologies that make it appear that academic success is the result of individual hard work and talent specifically. Things like neoliberalism can support epistemic exclusion because it purports that the free market will determine what the right outcomes are, so people who are epistemically excluded must not be the best out there. Similarly, things like the myth of meritocracy is the idea that those who work hard succeed. And if you are not experiencing success, it's an indication of either your lack of effort or your lack of ability or the unworthiness of what you do. And these legitimizing ideologies suggest that the ability and effort are rewarded with success, and therefore exclusion or failure are the result of individual rather than structural deficits. And broadly, all of these distal processes support epistemic exclusion by making it appear that academia is fair. Next slide. Here, I want to take a minute to briefly review the definitions, phenomenology, and forms of exclusion before we go into our main categories in a lot of depth. But as you've already heard, we make a distinction between epistemic exclusion in formal processes and epistemic exclusion in informal processes. So in formal epistemic exclusion, we see that there's an unwarranted, non-accidental, and predictable bias towards scholarly work and evaluation standards and norms by virtue of one's scholarship or status as a marginalized scholar, or an unwarranted with respect to one's contribution to the field or academic unit and contracts. So some of the key points here: unwarranted. Here, this refers to bias that's not supported, meaning one's contributions to the field, academic area, or unit is inconsistent with the judgment or evaluation that's being made about the work. And non-accidental or intentional. People have assumptions about the scholar or the scholarly work and then they evaluate the scholar and the work based on those assumptions rather than the work's actual quality. And predictable. Here, this refers to bias that can be declared in advance given our knowledge of the system and the players in the system and how that works. So within formal epistemic exclusion, there are criteria, metrics, and evaluative tactics that lend themselves to very predictable outcomes of inclusion for some and exclusion for others. And then formal epistemic exclusion occurs in a variety of processes of evaluation, such as our annual reviews, promotion and tenure evaluation, awards, and scholarship assessments. So we need to look at what are people using to make those assessments? How are they determining rigor? How do they think of as fit for a faculty to come in or fit for that scholar to be represented in the field? How are they thinking about things like impact for a journal or for scholarly work? And of course, none of these are neutral, but we often pretend or they are purported to be neutral. And then informal epistemic exclusion. Here we're seeing unwarranted, non-accidental, and repetitious or impactful bias towards scholarly work that occurs outside of formal evaluation processes and within informal sites of contact, so our everyday interactions. And these communicate exclusion and devaluation. Sorry, my dog's scratching all of a sudden. Here, the key points are what we found in our studies is that there are operations of epistemic exclusion, scholarly devaluations that occur outside of formal evaluation processes, and that this category is aimed at describing modes of scholarly devaluation that are executed in these everyday interactions. These are things that might happen at the water cooler, things that might happen at faculty meetings, but they are repetitious. So these informal devaluations of scholarly work and scholars occur regularly, and the recurrence helps to make it discernible as a practice over time. However, we also include impactful, because a one-time event could have occurred for an individual single time, and it may have had significant impact for them. And we can talk more about that perhaps later. So together, these formal processes and informal economies contribute to the phenomenologically of exclusion, both the feelings of the person excluded and how the way the scholarship they work is treated. Next slide. So talking about formal criteria of exclusion. Here we're looking at, again, unwarranted, non-accidental, and predictable bias in the criteria or in the metrics, specific metrics that are used to evaluate a scholar's work. So a criteria exclusion could be that the general rules and principles underlying the evaluation standards, like a critical component of the criteria exclusion is like a yes, no. So the type of work I do is not reflected in my unit's evaluation standards. But it could also happen as a metric exclusion. And here what's important for a metric exclusion is that the use of the evaluation metrics result in non-accidental, unwarranted, and predictable devaluing or degrading of scholarly work. For example, publication outlets or particular journals or presses that may be most receptive to the scholar's work are deemed lower in status when they're being evaluated. And then there's formal application excluded. Here what we see is that the metrics are applied differently in a way that devalues the scholarly work. So these acknowledge that the criteria and the metrics as they stand allow for appropriate evaluation, but how they're being applied is different when evaluating certain scholars in their scholarship. So an example of that might be, according to the evaluation standards in my unit, my scholarly work should be viewed positively, but it is not. Next slide. And for informal, we see that informal economies, this component reflects perceptions and interactions that reflect and maintain scholarly exclusion and would answer the question, how does my scholarly marginalization occur out of institutional evaluation processes? So we propose that this happens through legitimacy exclusions, the ways in which competence, skills, or expertise and knowledge are denied. Contribution exclusions, where they experience a denial, minimization, or failure to recognize the contribution or significance of the work. And a comprehension exclusion refers to the denial, minimization, or limited recognition and the understandability, familiarity, and legitimacy of the work. So here, colleagues in my unit claim they don't understand my scholarly work, or colleagues in my unit do not think my work is part of the field. Next slide. And for all, actually, yes.
NiCole, just real quick, are you about done?
I can go forward. If we could go forward to consequences of EE for fields. Okay.
I thought you had a couple of more slides in there.
Yes. So part of why this work is important is because epistemic exclusion is dangerous to individuals and to institutions, but we often forget that it's also harmful to fields of study. It leads to disciplinary inertia, such that things continue to be done in the same way, where we lose innovation, we lose novel questions, new applications, and adaptations. Next. So encountering epistemic exclusion, we can talk about this in more detail, and you will also have the slides, but we need to do things that increase awareness at the basic level. What are the values that we're bringing to science? How does that play out? And who gets left to the outside when we have these types of values? Are they really central to what we're doing, or do we pretend they are in a way that limits our work? So thinking about how might we shift values and norms, and how could we then shift policies and practices that reflect our changing values? And finally, we have to have accountability. This is thinking about how do we continue to monitor faculty hiring, advancement, who's getting awards in our fields, what is being published in our journals. And I want to note that addressing EE does not exclude scholars that are doing traditional work. It's just creating space for those scholars that are doing things that have typically been marginalized. Next slide. We can go one more slide. And some other things to consider is auditing our current practices, thinking about who we're giving awards to. I heard in the earlier talks, having consideration about, has this person been brought up on sexual harassment charges, but also looking across and saying, all right, who's getting the awards? If the people all tend to look the same, then there's a problem in who we're selecting, what our selection criteria are. Paying really special attention to our journal practices, who is published, the top topics that are routinely being rejected, how we're looking at citation and thinking about how we can fund culture change initiatives. All of these things become really valuable. And I have also a set of additional resources that I will put in the chat, and we can go to the next slide. For questions, and one more slide, we'll have a link that people can go to see more of the resources that we have on epistemic exclusion specifically. With that, I will say thank you and go to questions.
Thank you so much, NiCole. And I'm sorry to like kind of snap some of your talk there, but the slides are available for everybody. So I hope that people can go in there, and hopefully we'll get some additional questions now as well from the audience. So we are running a little bit tight on time. So originally we had 15 minutes and 15 minutes, or 15 minutes for moderated discussion and 15 minutes for Q&A. And now we have 10 for each of those. So what I'm going to ask people to do is if they can send questions directly to Taylor for each of the panelists, if they have questions, and to specify who those questions are for, that'll help me a lot. And like while I'm doing a few questions of my own for each of the panelists, okay? So I'm going to try to keep our time in terms of these moderated questions pretty tight. But then also we do definitely want to get to the other questions. So NiCole, I wanted to start with you because you're like the most recent person right now, right? But and you got to this toward the end, but I want to highlight that you're developing a tool, a measure for understanding if you have this happening, correct? Can you tell
Absolutely.
me a teensy bit about that tool? Oh, and actually for all of y'all, keep your answers as tight as possible here if you
Sure.
can. Please, please, please.
Well, I don't know I have a summary in the slides, but we have developed a tool and used a really extensive process for developing this tool and piloting it. And we're finding right now we have 39 items that have functioned very, very well for looking at the main components of both formal and informal. And psychometrically, it's incredibly sound, and we've got the beginning pilot study results, and we're really proud of it. And one of the things that I suggest for societies is to think about doing climate surveys of your members and using something like our faculty epistemic exclusion scale so that you can see how it's operating for your members and for your field. And we'd be happy to work with organizations to draft the survey, help run the survey, and summarize the results for your organization.
And this seems particularly important when you think about sort of award granting, which I know you raised this, and also like, journal publication, like who decides what actually gets in and what doesn't. So like for journal editors and those editorial teams. So it could potentially also be used for things like I wonder if your tool could be used for like your editorial board, just to prompt them to even think about the extent to which they're engaging this, or to prompt, your awards committees to prompt them to think, not so much from an experiential perspective, but from like a vision perspective from these boards and editorial boards. Are they engaging in this? Do you think you can use the tool that way?
Absolutely. And in fact, what I typically will encourage is a consideration of how can you make these things systematic, where you're looking at metrics and you're hitting milestones, you're publicly saying what those milestones might be, and then moving and progressing over time and reporting how you're progressing. So these things are wonderful when we're thinking about how we're hiring for our editorial boards, what is the diversity of the manuscripts that we're accepting or rejecting, and being able to systematically look at that. And in fact, we have, I put it in the chat and people are able to look at it at another time, but we have a diversity accountability index for journal publishers and editors. And it goes through different ways that we can instill accountability. If you are, say, the editor, a reviewer, if you're conducting research or publishing research, how can we build these into our systems and make sure that we're really moving towards more equitable practices. The University of Michigan has a component of their training for all hiring committees that specifically talks about epistemic exclusion. And so a similar type of training could happen for every new awards committee for the journal editors.
That's awesome. So we have to break that loop of exclusion at some point. And so, you know, these are ways that you can potentially do that. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your work on that.
Going back to this idea of how does this end up playing out? What we're seeing is, particularly post-COVID, we are losing faculty in droves. And for faculty that do research that's marginalized, faculty that are doing research related to core identities that are devalued in society, we're losing them at a higher proportion. And part of that is the extra burden that goes along with experiencing epistemic exclusion.
Well done. So Cheryl, a quick question for you. Have you seen the appointment of small numbers of people from marginalized communities to governing bodies ensure that those bodies really center in their deliberations the needs and interests of those marginalized individuals and communities? So has bringing in those people really helped to shift those conversations?
For sure, it has helped shift. And if we just take an example from our council, which is a really large group, 75 people, right? One of the things that you have to think about is how then do you elevate or make space for the student and early career to even have a voice? 6 people out of 75, right? We do a lot of work in table groups. And so the way that you set up your group, the way that you set up your meeting, the way that you set up each topic really has a lot to do with how free they feel to speak up. And of course, it's easier to speak up in a table group, but it takes only a second for really the rest of the council to understand the value that the marginalized group in this case brings to the table.
So I think that one of the things that happens there is that in bringing in, you know, kind of marginalized people from marginalized identities, they sometimes feel like it's their only job to do that, or they feel like they can't do it because they're overpowered, right? So it's a trick in terms of creating the using psychological language, because that's what I am, a psychologist. It's a trick. It's a really tricky space to create the psychological safety for those individuals to feel like they can take that risk and voice. So I love the idea of creating small table conversations. I think that absolutely can facilitate that. Also, just like setting norms and expectations at the beginnings of meetings, in terms of like, you know, like saying to everybody, saying, you know, like, it's not their job to be the only people to raise these issues, right? That's not their job. We are all responsible for making sure that everybody's voice is heard, and that we're taking into account issues that represent everybody, right? And so it's a really fine kind of balancing space to be in. But I do think that leaders setting those expectations at the beginning of meetings can make a difference. The ways that you structure those conversations, like you're saying, in those small kinds of meetings or those small conversations, can make a huge difference as well. And so that's awesome. That's awesome.
I'll just say maybe one other thing, which is the younger generation is not shy. They are more than willing to speak up if you give them an opportunity. And like I said, their value then becomes heard really, really quickly. So if you have a small table group discussion, very often that table says, well, we're going to let the student or the early career speak for us. And then they gain an immediate respect and audience because they do just a really great job every single time. Or you take a conversation. We had a generative conversation about 2 years ago. I think our last meeting, maybe before COVID, our last in-person meeting, and you know, people wrestled for a good hour or more about something, and then one student in her career stood up and said, I don't understand what we're talking about. The train has left the station. We're already living in this reality. Mic drop. I mean, pin drop. Complete silence in the room. That's where you get your value really, really quickly.
Nice, nice. Larry, I have a question for you. And so, you know, for the audience perspectives, I know Larry and NiCole quite well already. So, so, you know, like kind of my teasing on Larry is because I know him so well already. But in your experience, what is it about mentoring that makes it such a powerful tool for leveraging equity and inclusion? Are there particular aspects of mentoring programs that really heighten that leverage or diminish that leverage?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on this quite a bit, even outside of the context of the DIP program, just so like in my own lab and in my own interactions with people. And I think that what it is, both my mentees and my mentors, and I think what it is that's really, really key is the personal connection. And it's like, oh, well, that's kind of a cop-out answer. But I think that that's really, really key, especially right now, post-COVID, in a remote world. People feel isolated, people feel lonely. And in a professional sense, there's less, at least, you know, depending on what your situation is, but if you're working remotely, it's really hard to be a good mentor and be a mentor in a way that is communicating support for you as a person, for you as a professional, for you as somebody who has relatively less power, right? It's like your mentor is the person that is giving you a sense of security, I think, as a professional person, right? It's like you're the person that they look to and they're looking to see your reactions to see if they're doing a good job. They're looking for your feedback. They're looking for, you know, I think even a slighted glance from an advisor, from a mentor, can communicate a lot of things to a mentee that we may not even be aware of, right? And by the same token, I think a supportive comment, a 5-minute conversation with a mentee that just says like, you know, you're doing a good job. I really appreciate what you're doing. I know that it's hard. You're going to be busy moving forward over the next couple months. These are the 3 things I want you to prioritize in this order. How are you doing personally? Great, goodbye, I'll see you in a few days. That's a conversation I had this morning with one of my mentees, and you could hear in her voice this sense of like, thank you, I feel better, you know, and I think that that's what we should all be looking for in our mentoring relationships, is seeking that end of the conversation where the mentee feels secure, they know what's happening, and it's like, okay, I've gotten my 5 or 10 minutes, and I now know what to do, and the world is now okay again because my advisor, my mentor told me that it is, right? I think there's a lot of power that goes unrecognized in those types of relationships, and just recognizing that and being delicate and compassionate and optimistic in those types of relationships goes a long, long way. And it's not a specific skill, you know, it's just sort of being there in a real way for people when they need you to be there. So that's my honest answer.
That's awesome. And then when you think about kind of the role of the professional society, right, in all of this, because the professional societies are the places where the students, these, you know, either, you know, your DIP program was for undergraduate students, but undergraduate, graduate students, you know, postdocs, even early career scholars, like any mentorship can come at a lot of different levels, right? But this idea that you're sort of hinging it around the professional identity is also really of value. You know, sort of within institution mentorship programs address completely different issues than a within profession mentorship program can actually address. And so I think that there's some like a different value going on with that kind of a program, but they take some effort, right? You know, in kind of trying to do them. And I know one of the breakout sessions this afternoon is about mentor programs within professional societies and what are some of the challenges and whatnot with that. So audience people, we need questions from y'all. I've been told that there aren't questions, and I can't believe that. So I am going to put out another call for questions. You send them to Taylor, and Taylor will shoot them on to me. And if you can just specify who that question might be for, that would be really helpful. We still have another 7 minutes for our session. So then I have more questions. So I'm fine doing that, but I'd much rather hear what your questions are rather than just, kind of keep coming back to my questions because I think that's more engaging. So please send your questions. And yes, I'm wagging my finger. So please send your questions to Taylor so that we can get them. So one other thing for Cheryl in terms of like just integrating lots of people in leadership types of spaces, right? You've said, and I think that the quote is, individual scientists worldwide are all equals in all AGU activities. So what does that really mean in practice? Are there stakes, challenges that are different for early career members who are from outside the US? What does that really mean?
Yeah, so AGU has a partnership culture, which the easiest definition of that is that our volunteers and our members and our staff are equally responsible to accomplish the strategic plan. I know that doesn't really answer your question, but that is an important cultural thing for you to understand, because if you've elevated staff to the same level as members in accomplishing your strategic plan, you can get to what you just said about everybody has an So that quote that you just said came from our 2010 strategic plan. I believe it was part of our Envision Future or the core values. This will happen if in order for us to accomplish the future that we envision. And again, it goes back to what I said before. Your question kind of threw me because you started talking about marginalized communities. And I was like, but I don't feel like the student and early career scientists in our organization are marginalized anymore. So they may have been in the past, but I'm not sure that even they would feel like they're marginalized. But that's a really great question. So thanks for asking it. What I would say is, again, it hinges on how do you set up the group, right? If everybody in the group is bringing a perspective and you're clear about that. So the way we form groups, like committee groups, is we say, well, here's the charge. Well, what perspectives do we need to accomplish that charge? And then you go find that. And then if everybody understands the reason they're in the group is to bring this unique perspective, and the work isn't really fulfilled until all the perspectives are on the table so the best decision can be made. If you're setting up groups like that, then you're giving everybody an equal voice.
One follow-up question that came from an audience member.
Yay!
For you, Cheryl, is can you tell us more about how you recruit these new young leaders into these positions?
So this demographic is the easiest one to recruit of everybody. So I have about 500 volunteers that fall directly under me, and I have no trouble finding student and early career leaders. So, but for the council positions, which is a governance position, or the board positions, we generally put out a call to the people who are already on those bodies, because they understand what the work is. Who do you know that you think would be good? And then we also put out a more public call on our job board. But then there's a process, right? So we're going to get far more names than the 6 positions that we have on our council. So the committee actually runs a process that includes an application and then winnowing down the list from there so that you can have a paired slate for our election.
Nice, nice. Thank you. Couple of questions for Larry from the audience. So Larry, how does SciOp define success in terms of the DIP program?
I think we're figuring that out now, and what we're hoping for, the overall goal is increased representation with racial minorities in funded PhD programs. So that's the official sort of tagline. In terms of actually measuring that, we've sent surveys to the initial cohort. We're going to continue to follow them over the course of their academic careers. You know, did you apply to grad school? Did you get in? How many interviews? That type of thing. So we're going to have some objective metrics with respect to that. And I think there's also going to be a really long-term qualitative metric that may not even be measurable, right? So the idea is that if we're getting people into the society, that should have some sort of an impact, right? In the types of students that they take on as mentees eventually, as the types of projects that they end up doing, as the types of research questions that they end up tackling. I think that that's the idea, right? Is that we're diversifying the program, not just in terms of identity, but in terms of thought, in terms of experience, in terms of perspective, and in terms of the types of energy that we're bringing to the society. And I think that it's really exciting to see what it's going to be, but it's really hard to predict. And even I struggle with trying to figure out what the metric is, right? Of knowing whether it's been successful. I think we can look at the metrics in terms of admission rates and career success, but I think there's going to be a qualitative, immeasurable impact that I'm hoping we have. And that's a big question. If anybody has ideas, let me know.
So one other real quick question, Larry, is an audience member says, I'm hesitant to mentor younger scientists because I feel guilty encouraging people to pursue careers in profession where harassment is so common. Do you have any example of how you might have leveraged your own identity as a mentor to successfully advocate for stronger anti-harassment policies?
I think what I've done, and I'm in a unique position because I share a lot of minoritized identities. So I have the ability to look people in the face and say, I know what this is like. I know that you're going to experience this. You should expect, and I do research on diversity and inclusion, so I have that academic sort of background too. But you know, if you can anticipate the types of things that people are going to be experiencing and giving them a realistic preview of what that looks like, I think that goes a long way. And not pretending like, oh, you need to just be tough or whatever. It's like, you're going to have bad days and you're going to feel like you don't belong, but you do, and you can do that. You know, it's like sort of just acknowledging the elephant in the room and saying, it's not always going to be great. I think that's really powerful.
Yeah. One very quick question for NiCole. And this is somewhat about the EE, but also I think you could think about it more broadly in terms of like other climate kinds of surveys, which I know you have some experience with as well. And it has to be a quick answer because we're at time right now, but it's one more question and I want to make sure that it gets asked. So how do the results of society climate surveys typically inform society programs, policies, or actions? The audience member says, we'd love to do this type of survey, but it would be good to know how they can help their members really navigate these kinds of challenges.
Well, some of that would be independent of a survey, in all honesty. But because you can look at what's happening within the society and how you give awards, how you run your journals, who is prominent in leadership, these things are career changing opportunities. And so being able to look at that and then help people by bringing them in and building success is a piece of that. You could also look at having workshops that talk about these direct issues and help give people skills on how to navigate some of these things. Similar to what Larry was saying, part of what is so challenging about this is that people often don't have language for it. People around them are gaslighting and saying it's not happening. So having that language, having some empowerment, and being able to bridge their networks beyond their institution. So one, they know if there's other places that might be better for them, but also it helps them with all of the other monikers of success, like being able to get strong tenure letters, being able to demonstrate prominence in the field, being able to have the awards that can I don't want to use the word Trump now, but they can override the assessments of individuals within their organization and give them the prominence they need to leave and go elsewhere where they're going to be celebrated if necessary. But now specific with a survey, it lets you know what's actually happening to people. So then you can build interventions around the experiences people are having, and you can help with the discipline-wide narrative, because often climate surveys within an organization, people are afraid they're identifiable. So they're not always giving truthful information or full information. But when it's at the society level and it's informing, say, the American Chemistry Association, they're less concerned that the people doing the negative evaluations of them are going to find out what they had to say.
That's a super important point. Super important in that the professional societies have that sort of distance that can help to create honesty. That's really, really important.